Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to discuss this issue of uncertainty. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present some thought. My point will be also on the dynamics of institutions to some extent, but I will less concentrate on the economy as such and much more on the consequence for society. And my point is really, if we have a more market society, whatever that means, well, we have a problem of social stability. And the hypothesis I want to develop this morning is that in some context, somewhere we see emerging some new institutional framework to deal with uncertainty. As we know, this is all questions, how to make society more legible, predictable under capitalism. And as Jens has put in his introduction, the more an economy relies on competitive market, the greater the uncertainty economic actors face, and the more unstable the society, the more unstable the behaviour of actors. So we know that the classic question is, how do you create a social order? How do you try to bring in some stability? How do you try to create, that was the old idea, some institutions to guarantee a degree of predictability at the level of social action? So what I want to do this morning is really to go into this old economic sociology question, but really to bring in some more elements coming from rules and the states and bureaucracies. Just to remember, we all know that market society, we don't know what it means really, and it's an old question that Polanyi has been addressing and some other authors. And we're never sure what it means. It's an utopia, as we all know. But basically, if we come back to a very basic element, we are likely to bend towards a more market society when we have more market exchange within the regulation of society. It's supposed to be a society within which the behaviour of individuals is oriented, constrained, aligned, realigned towards the principle of the market economy. So the more people maximize their self-interest, are rational calculating actors, the more we are supposed to be in a market society. We also know from Polanyi that if we are more towards a market society, then the resistance has been destroyed against the traditional existing order. So we need to think about those mechanisms. And if we are in a more market society-like, then probably the ideas of a superiority of benevolent, natural, self-regulated market have become important or hegemonic. And we know that historically, the more we had something like a more market society, the more the questions of social stability has been a real question. I'm going to use as an example a background for my talk, which is not empirical this morning, but I'll be happy to develop afterwards, the UK case. Because in many ways, when you look at Western Europe, there's one place where there was a political project to really create a more market-oriented society. And from Mrs. Thatcher to Blair to Brown nowadays, and probably to Cameron tomorrow, there have been a constant effort by the elite of government to try to bring in some more market mechanism to govern and to adapt society. You know, even Giddens had this lovely phrase, the world owes us nothing, and you have to adapt to market globalization and a new phase of capitalism for the English society. So Britain is a good case because if there's a place where we have seen over the last 25, 26 years, nearly 30 years now, of attempt to create a more market society, then we also have seen, because of a long term, the destabilizing effect on the society and this issue of, some people would say, governability, governance, whatever you want to call it. But really the questions of how do we deal with uncertainty when you have more market relations? So I thought it would follow up Jens' questions. And the point here is to try to show that the answer in the British case has been on the one hand to try to create more market relationship and more market regulations in society, but on the other hand to try to create a new institutional framework in order to deal with instability and uncertainty. And I'm trying to call that bureaucratic revolution following Weber, but I'm very well aware that being French and speaking about Weber in this room is pretty dangerous, especially I'm not an expert on Marianne Weber's letter, so these days, you don't dare talking about Weber. But anyway, I'll use that sort of framework to make my argument. So really I want to do two things. Number one, to review classic argument about how do you overcome the instability of society under capitalist conditions, very briefly, because you're all familiar with that. And second, I'll develop these new institutional frameworks in the UK case, but with my colleague Alan Scott and Pierre Lascoub in Paris, we call the new bureaucratic revolution, which attempts to try to deal with this issue of uncertainty. And I'll conclude on the limits to that. And the point here is really to show how the innovation in policy instruments is a means, a way to try to make behaviors of actors more predictable. And I'll try to show 2 or 3 mechanisms in the space of my talk. Number one, as we know, the classic questions of how do we deal with societies where the questions of social order is being destabilized by capitalism, it's a classic question in sociology. And you all remember that Marx said, one way to deal with that is to look at what the state is doing. And you're all familiar with the idea of that. And the Marxist framework, you look at the state trying to force, to constrain, to use legislative power, but also the state promoting an ideology to stabilize social relations and legitimizing the existing social order, of a state to create the accumulation, the conditions of accumulation. And of course, at a time of economic crisis and financial crisis, that will be my only reference to the financial crisis. Of course, when we see this destabilizing impact of the crisis, what do we see? We see some cold contesting the ideology that we had. We see some new state intervention to recreate the condition of safe accumulation for the banking sector. Sometimes it's called socializing the profit, the losses. And we'll see the classic way of the state coming in and saying we should have new regulation. So, there are some ideas to bring in at the moment, at least in France, I'm sure not in Germany, but in the UK. A second way to deal with these questions of uncertainty is to come back on the idea of new rules and new state. And you may be familiar with the book of James Scott, Seeing Like a State. And Scott makes a very powerful point about the problem of the governing elite in the 17th century or in the old days of pre-modern society. And he said the problem of a new modern state was to govern and to do something with countries and people they didn't know. So the whole problem of state rationalization was to create legibility, standardization. And that was the way through which you would be able to deal with uncertainty, economic or not economic. And you may remember that he emphasizes key processes through which you sort of decrease the uncertainty, the classic issues of rationalization. And in to create this modern society that you could govern, to make it legible, where all these things like creating permanent last name, the metric system, the cadastral surveys, freehold tenure, standardization of language, legal standardization. So the point here is that in a situation of uncertainty, one way to deal with that is to create a new set of institutions, a new set of rationalization instruments in order to deal with uncertainty. You also remember that Polanyi explained to us that laissez-faire was planned, and the more market exchanges you have, the more rules you have. So you have to look at the same time at the ways in which the state or some political power are used to destroy past order, and how you create new set of rules, new set of sanctions and rewards to reorient, to change the behavior of people, to create the homo economicus. So the creation of market subject through insecurity and unpredictability. And Polanyi, remember, used the word fear and anger by saying that when people are lost in a situation where you have lots of market uncertainty, then fear and anger are really key resort to use to try to create new institutions and to recreate stability. And of course, if we think about stability and dealing with uncertainty, we have to use Weber, and again, careful. But as you remember, in the classic analysis of bureaucracy, we have the idea of standardizing procedures to make behaviors and outcomes more predictable. And the whole point about the rational bureaucracy, both in the private and the public sector, was, of course, to make sure that you could ensure efficiency and the stability of outcomes and behavior. And I don't want to develop too much this thing, but that's the logic of bureaucratic domination and rationalization. So stability and predictability are key mechanisms for securing loyalty, and you are common, control, obedience. I'm sure you know all these things perfectly well. So what is the point here? We know that classically, when we had this emergence of capitalism and more market relations at some given point in time, the founding fathers of sociology and some of the leading authors in economic sociology have been telling us the answer was new rules, new state, new bureaucracy, new standardizations, and the creation of very new ways of policy instruments to try new institutions, to try to deal with these questions of social and political order. On the important point here, we have the word rewards and sanctions, clear in the Polanyian framework. The idea that you have to find new mechanisms to make behavior predictable. And this issue of how do we make sure, how do we get some predictability in the behavior of actors when you have more competition, when you have more inequalities, is a key issue for both economic actors and political actors. And from those brief reviews, I've been making the point that one of the key points is, of course, to develop knowledge about society and to make society legible. So let's try to use that, and let's try to think about, along those terms, to apply that to the UK case. And the argument is more or less about that. It's to say the UK case, because of this attempt by political elite to create a more market-oriented society, and you remember Mrs. Thatcher explaining that there is no such thing as society, just families, there was a constant attempt to try to really realign the behavior of people, to transform them as maximizing interest actors, or rational calculating actors. And this has been an absolutely key dimension of this political project, by using the state. And the point is not here, as again, a major insight from Weber. In France, we find it very difficult to understand that you can have the state against the market. The idea that the two are complementary, can go together, is very difficult for our mind. So the point is that in the UK case, because of these problems of creating a much more market-oriented society, that has created a lot of uncertainty and instability in the UK society. So a new set of institutions, and I will use bureaucratic revolution, have been developed in order to make the behavior of individuals more predictable and more under control. And that's what I want to demonstrate here with some insights and some example and showing some mechanism, and that's part of a larger work project. Can I just remind you as well, but you're already familiar with this argument, that in the word of Weber, of course, bureaucracy is also a revolutionary forces of social change. And it contrasts, remember, charisma and bureaucracy. And there's this famous quote from Weber about bureaucratic rationalisation, which is a revolutionary force of the first order against tradition, against existing social and political order. And it revolutionizes by technical means, I would say by policy instruments these days, from the outside. Right? It's supposed to revolutionize things, to structure them, people, and really changing the conditions under which individuals have to adapt to the outside world. So do not underestimate the bureaucracy as a revolutionary force to change society and to try to bring in both uncertainty, to bring in more market relations. Market-making bureaucracy, in a way, is what we do in public policy these days. And on the other hand, to create a new set of institutions to change the behavior and make the behavior of people more predictable. So that's the logic of dealing with uncertainty in this issue. In the UK case, that's what was done. There's a famous book by Michael Moran in the UK, who is an analyst of the UK political order. And he says, for a long time in the UK, and Colin Crouch also says something similar, it was a country which was run by tradition and a club logic. And since Mrs. Thatcher, this has become the world of hyper-innovation. There are more public policy experiments, more innovations, more agencies, more new structures being created in the UK than anywhere else in the world over the last 25 years. So it's a place where, and that's my first point, in order to destabilize the existing order, you do not just include or bring in more market, you bring in new innovations, new policy instruments, new rules, new institutions all the time. So that's one way, that's one mechanism to destabilize the existing order, to delegitimize the order. I want to argue now that on the one end, you try to do this hyper-innovation in order to destabilize the behavior of people, and then progressively you create a new set of sanctions and reward to make the behavior of people more predictable. The thing about this mechanism, we tend to think about bureaucracy as long-term, stable, predictability, all the Weberian framework. But this is exactly the opposite in this new bureaucratic revolution. The point is precisely to bring in change all the time in order to destabilize, to prevent people to adapt with their old rules. And by changing these rules all the time, people don't know what to do. They're lost. Remember fear and anger in the Polanyian framework, and then to give them the sense of change. So the tempo is increased by controlled instability, intentional and constant rearrangement of the parameters under which decisions have to be made and action taken. To increase speed through the constant change of parameters is really to make actors lost. And actors are not able to develop their own strategy because they have to adapt all the time to new rules of the game. And then you institutionalize a different set of sanctions and rewards. For those who have been to the UK universities over the last 25 years, and we should always start by mocking our own corporation first, you may remember what the university system was in the UK a long time ago, with all these leftist sociologists running the show. And what has happened, you may have heard of a rating assessment exercise. So this is typically a system where you evaluate research and you grade the department. So you have to create a framework, and then you tell people, well, if you have a good grade, you have more money. But then 3 years later, you change the parameters, so people cannot adapt to the new framework. And then you change the parameters again 3 years later. And what happens after 5, 6, 7 times is that when you look at your colleagues nowadays, what do, British colleagues at the moment? They are waiting for the new rules for the next rating exercise, because the rules will be changed again. So do they put all their research money and all the investment in specific programs? No, they wait, because they know that the way they will be evaluated next time is going to change, because it has changed over the last 20 years. So they cannot develop their own strategy. They got more autonomy, but they have to wait, and they have to learn to jump in the new loop. It's the same thing for hospitals, it's the same thing for schools. By bringing in new priorities each time, people have sort of jump and try to adapt to the new situation. And that's a very powerful mechanism to delegitimize the existing social order, because in conditions of speed and uncertainty, people have short-term, and this short-termism of policy innovation all the time and changing the parameters under which people are supposed to act leads to people to have some rational answer, which is wait, learn the new rules of the game, change them, of course, adapt, be creative, but change your behavior all the time. And the more you destabilize them, the more their behavior becomes predictable, because they have learned that this system of constant change is also a system under which parameters of sanctions and rewards will change over time. So subjects are acting within uncertain shifting parameters that replace command as the chief mechanism to secure predictability of outcome. By systematic destabilization and changing the rules of the game and the patterns of sanctions and rewards, progressively you are moving from one system to the next. And I will give you an example. Because actors progressively, you have the quick and the dead in that system. You have those who will learn the new rules and those who will not learn the new rules. And you will have experience of sanctions and rewards. When the new system to rate the hospitals was introduced, at some point the idea was we should have more privatization, more market, more internal market within hospitals. Well, you have to create a framework and to rate hospitals from 1 star to 4 stars. Okay? Everybody says this is ridiculous, how you can grade an hospital with 25 indicators. It doesn't make any sense. Of course it doesn't make any sense. But you create a 4-star hospital framework and 1 star. And then the minister says, oh, we'll have a new game. We'll change the indicators for next time. But next time, hospital with 4 stars will have more money and more autonomy, and will give some special payment to the director of hospitals with 4 stars. And hospital with 1 star, we're going to close them. Maybe not the first time. Number 1, we'll sack the director, and if they have only 1 star next time, then we'll close the hospital. So progressively, the system is moving. Progressively, some actors in the system are learning that if they follow the new indicators, the new priorities, the new system of sanctions and reward, they will gain if they behave as calculating actor following the new rules of the game. Those who oppose the system say, we don't care. But when the sanction system starts to operate, when they get less money, when their payment is less important, or when the hospital closes, or when your university department closes, even a hard left urban sociologist becomes a calculating actor when he knows that he's losing his job if he doesn't behave according to the priorities set by the government for his department. So that's, I would argue, the logic. It's a system which is on the move. And years after years, it takes about 10, 15 years to really get it working. And with my colleague Scott, we're trying to compare different domains in the UK. And what we are arguing is that, that's why it's a bit pompous to say bureaucratic revolution, but what we are arguing is that we now see a systematic ways of creating a new institutional framework in the UK case, which applies to different domains, different policy sectors. And the logic is the same. It's really destabilizing, delegitimizing the existing order, old professions, and creating a new system with more market relations, more competition, and a different system of sanctions and rewards. So to do that, you have 4 phases that we identified in different domains. Again, to deal with uncertainty. And those 4 phases, they are not always at the same time. It's not a linear process. Some phases start in some sectors before others, but we identify analytically these 4 phases to create this new institutional environment. The first phase is that in order to deal with this uncertainty, basically it's the old idea that you need to create a new bureaucracy. You know, the old idea that the more market you have, the more market exchanges you have, the more rules you have, still applies very, very well. You may know that the UK has created more new bureaucracies than France, for instance. They have created more civil servants in part of the bureaucracy. You may be familiar with privatization and all that, but in fact, there's a new bureaucracy which has been created, which has become very, very, very big. They have created new auditing, new council, the Audit Council, the National Audit Organizations. All these organizations to produce norms, to produce standards. In all different sectors, you identify 5, 6, 2 new organizations, which role is to create, to develop the standards, the best practice, the new indicators, and which the other ones will have to adapt. So this has become big business. Auditing, creating standards has become very, very big business. You have the growth of a huge bureaucracy in the UK around that, together of creating new knowledge, making this new world more legible. And of course, the big innovation in bureaucracy to make behavior predictable is the high-tech revolution, reporting. And again, it's the same thing in private organization and public organizations. Again, Weber was not wrong there. And you see, thanks to the computer system, the massive gathering of data. In this bureaucratic revolution, you need huge system of information to be able to have huge amount of indicators and to aggregate all these indicators together. This UK bureaucratic revolution is a fantastic IT exercise. And of course, some people argue it's the old Jeremy Bentham utilitarist idea. The more you watch, the better you behave. And this is about that. And I understand some of these things may take place in German universities, but maybe not. We'll discuss that later. But we see the logic of trying to identify, document, give precise indicators of any action and any activities within the domain you're here. So the logic is, again, rationalisation, introducing reporting, indicators, regulation agencies. So that's a huge new world of auditing and control and high-tech indicators to precisely monitor what is going on in society. So you could argue it's a new phase of rationalization with the idea that the more you produce precise statistics, the more you will know what is going on in precise domain. And there's a wonderful rationality illusion there, because if you're a minister now in the UK, you go anywhere, tomorrow you have a new Ministry for Health, and you go to Sheffield, in the train, you take your computer, you push a button, and you have about 600 indicators on what is going on in Sheffield hospitals, plus one aggregated indicator, 1 star, 2 stars, 3 stars, 4 stars. And then you arrive there, you do your speech, you only have 2 stars, next time you should do better. So this is a very important point. The second phase is that really to bring in a new measure to improve the system. Once you have done this extremely important job of producing new data, new knowledge, new categories, new statistics, then the next step is to try to define performance indicators so that people will try to reach them, and then to design the system of sanction and rewards going with that. And that, again, is a very strong process which is extremely rationalized. It's not a peer review or it's not classic old inspection. It's really trying to go into the micro-management. You may know that when Gordon Brown was Minister of Exchequer, Lord of Exchequer, what he did was, for each ministry, he asked them to design an extremely large system of indicators, more than 500, to precisely report on a day-to-day basis on activities and expenditure. So the logic is a micromanagement, and again, it echoes what's going on in the private sector to a large extent. A third phase, of course, is then to design and to codify the system of sanctions and rewards. And the logic here is that you will have incentivization, lovely word. You've done some rational choice, you know this thing. And the one I like very much is to develop some logic of earned autonomy. That's a very nice word, earned autonomy. Like children, if they behave properly, they will have some responses. And that's the logic. In this logic, you are really giving more autonomy to people, to organizations to behave. They can choose to follow or not to follow the system of sanctions and rewards. But progressively, you have the institutionalization process. Those sanctions and those rewards become more precise, becomes clearer, becomes more applied. And as I said, the first round of evaluation, hospitals, universities, schools, local authorities, they are not believing into the competition. They say, that doesn't make sense, it's just something stupid. But, 4 or 5 rounds later, 15 years later, when you see that your personal prestige status or your revenue or your organization status is completely decreasing or increasing because of this competition around this framework, then it has some long-term impact. When you talk to your young British colleague in universities, they know the rule of the game. As we speak, they are waiting for the new publication, as I said, of the ministry about the next assessment exercise, and they will change their behavior accordingly. They know that their promotion, their salary will depend along that. 20 years ago, it made no sense, of course. Not to mention left-wing sociologists buying universities to be more competitive in some places, like in Manchester. And last phase is to have systematic comparison and to try to create a ranking, league table, competition, aggregated indicators in order to get the system moving and to all the time changing and bring new indicators so that people don't adapt but have to change and to adapt all the time. So in a way, what I really want to insist here is that in order to bring in some stability when you have more competition, you have to bring in, you could even go as far as saying new policy instruments, a new iron cage of parameters under which people are supposed to behave. We develop an analysis of political sociology of policy instruments to do that, but that's probably not for today. Can I just show the idea that, now just looking at the time, that classically we used to look at policy instruments by the state and government according to tax and legislative and all that. And what we see nowadays is the last bit of the table, that in many domains to control the economy, to change, to reform various actors, state elites tend to use rather competitive mechanisms, norms, standards, in order to bring change over time. So it's a very different way to govern and to try to ensure the predictability of the behavior of people. Short-termism, rewards and sanctions, legibility, indicators. That's the logic of a system. A good example, if I had time, would be to bring precise example of creating internal markets and to bring competition into some former public sector and look at the conditions under which those markets are progressively changing actors from the outside. Actors don't change their value. They don't change from inside. They don't change their belief, but they change their behavior progressively. And that leads to micro-change. It's at the level of individuals that you see this different reaction towards those goals with the idea of speed. And competitive bidding is an interesting one. And of course, if I was, wanted to push that, we could discuss the excellence initiative in your country to see the long-term effect that it will have. So the logic of this new bureaucratic revolution, if it makes sense, is really to give individuals and organizations more autonomy, but with less control. And that's the source of stability. You give them more autonomy to choose the way we're doing things, but with a very strict system of parameters and reporting. And as a mechanism of control, you have shifting environment parameters all the time. And that's the formation of these parameters which is central rather than routine daily decision in bureaucratic manipulation. Changing the parameters, that's what is really the important point. So what I've been trying to do really here is to try to point, and I could be much more precise, on the mechanism linking the state to social change and the making of a slightly different political order. And what is interesting in the UK case is that some of them just didn't work at all. And I could come back on the protest against those mechanisms, or how over time you have very large number of unexpected effect, because there's so much you can do with indicators. And of course, you know how people are, they know the rules of the game, and after a while, they know how to play the indicators. They know how to manipulate indicators of performance. And after a while, what is fascinating in the UK case is the extent to which this extremely detailed and precise system of indicators to monitor various activities is actually less and less reliable, because people learn to do the reporting activities and they learn to cheat with reporting activities. So, politically you would argue that the exhaustion of a new Labour project is also the exhaustion of this project of hyper-rationalist control of society through indicators. And after a while, it doesn't work anymore. You cannot say every day, oh, one indicator is much better. It's like Orwell, new indicators all the time being better, and nobody believes in them after a while. But what is interesting is you see the visible hand of the state to try to bring in social stability. And as Gamble used to say, it's a case of more market and a strong state to try to bring in stability. So the question is how you deal with uncertainty. Well, the classic answer here is bring in a different bureaucracy, bring in a different kind of state. So in a way, this argument is very similar to what we see in the private sector. There's this lovely book by Stephen Vogel about 10 years ago called Freer Markets, More Rules, where he was exactly making some similar kind of point by showing that the more firms had some autonomy, the more you had some rules to govern them, and the more within firms you needed, on the one hand, less control, more autonomy for individuals within firm, but in a different set of parameters where, in fact, they're losing control and losing the capacity to modify their behavior. In other words, to make their behavior more predictable. And both corporate and political governance follow this pattern. So there's a real new autonomy, but the beneficiaries find themselves in shifting opportunity structures within which they must operate and which they do not have direct control. My last point is, and I would be ready to, of course, to document that much more precisely, you've got a book on that, on the UK case, is if, as we pompously argue, it is a sort of new bureaucratic revolution, then it should not be just in the UK, of course. There should be some element of exporting this revolution. Well, when you look at the EU level, or when you look at France, I see a lot of that. But I'm told that even in Germany, even in the German university system, we see some element of starting to do bidding for excellence initiative. We see some element of rationalisation and documenting very precisely the activities going on in my world, creating a system of knowledge and making more legible the activities. So then, if someone wants, it's very easy to go into the next step and to get people move towards a different system of sanctions and indicators. Of course, not in Germany, but in France, it's absolutely clear that in some domains, not everywhere, but in the economic policy, in the university system, in those systems, in the health system, we see exactly that. We see the fourth phase that you can map out, document empirically, and see a different bureaucratic system in order to make behavior more predictable and to realign the society a little bit, up to which dimension remains open, towards a more market society in the sense I define. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. Okay, thank you very much, Patrick, for this fascinating lecture. We have now again about 10 minutes time for discussion. Who would like to raise a question or make a comment? Here, the gentleman on the right.
Wil Martens, Nijmegen. In fact, I'm a little bit surprised about the pessimistic tone of the things you have said. Because on the other hand, you also say you can't always introduce new rules, new norms, and tell people that those rules and norms are better. So there is something like legitimation, values that are said are going to be realized better, I think, through those measures and those ways of surveying behavior. So isn't it possible that, and don't we see already, that you can protest and that you can say, well, is it really better? Are values realized better? Is there better care? So it is not only, I think, a movement of other rules in our rationalized society are always rules and are understood as rules, even by managers and bureaucrats, I think, as rules for the sake of realizing some values. Can't we get that kind of thought back into discussion? Thank you.
Well, you bring in the normative point here, which I try to avoid in my talk. Well, it's not a question of being pessimistic. It was an experiment at a given moment in time. And the logic was clearly to precisely using short-termism in order to destabilize the existing order and then to make people adapt. And yes, some people protested. And I'm not saying it will be the same thing in the UK than in other places, because there will be more protests in some other countries, and there are specific conditions explaining why they were able to bring in all this changing because of failures of past solution. But do not overestimate. The whole point here is really to try to disconnect, in a way, the general goals of society and the general long-term thing from very precise short-term mechanism, which will, on the long term, produce some of the changes that the governing elite was hoping for. And where you're right is, so I don't want to be too pessimistic, is that after a while, we see the unintended effect. But this system has been extremely effective in some sectors, in the UK situation, to realign the way people behave. And again, I mean, I always, for such an audience, think about what was a British university 30 years ago and look at the way people behave now. This is exactly what happened in many ways. So now they are, and they protested. They protested. The beauty of this argument is that imagine you are in a sociology department in Lancaster in 1985. Okay? So leftist sociologists, all against the government, we will not accept that new system. Right? Yes, but your university is losing money. And what happens in your department? You realize that some of your colleagues don't work that much. And you think, well, you know, if we just got rid of 2 or 3 semi-retired people, then we'll improve our indicators. And you also think that, you know, it's a pity because Manchester got a very good grade and they got a lot of money. And so the best people, the best young people are going there. So the point is that if you individually protest and don't like this system, after a while, when you see your good colleagues going on, or you're a surgeon, when you see your young doctors leaving, or you don't have money to buy a new machine, you think, you know, a little bit of competition is not that bad. Well, that's the logic of a system, the quick and the dead. And you bring in a little bit of competition in your department, but of course opposing the system. And then next time, you do a little bit more, because a bigger proportion of the department will say, we have to resist these dreadful Thatcherite ideas, but on the other hand, we should be the best sociology department in the country, and it should be seen and visible. Because if we are not visible, we do not get the money from new students, and we lose the good colleagues, or if you're in hospital, we're losing clients. And then 10 years later, when you are told, you either change your behavior or we close your department, and remember, 1/3 of British departments were closed in the UK, 15 hospitals were closed, then, you know, even if you are opposed to this thing, even if you don't believe in the legitimacy of the system, there's a point where your micro-interest is a little bit to follow the rules and the new system of indicators. And 25 years later, the same sociologist, hard left-wing from Lancaster, Manchester, they run the university, they buy the university to be more competitive, and they play this game extremely effectively. So the point is, yes, there are some protests. I'm just saying that at a given moment in the UK, there was a very strong dynamics, and it indeed realigned up to a point the behavior of people. And then you had all the unintended effect, and it was not just a protest against the system, but manipulating the system and making him completely irrelevant, which is a different way, I think, to answer your question. We'll see in Germany whether there will be some temptation at some point to bring in a little bit of dynamic in the system, as they say.
Rainer Diaz-Bohne, I hope I understood your lecture correctly. What I understood was very exciting for me because you reversed the problem of uncertainty. Uncertainty is a tool for domination.
Exactly.
It's induced or introduced by governments or institutions to control the actors in a field. My question from a Weberian perspective is, what about legitimation? And from an economic perspective, what about efficiency? Because if you destroy the set of rules regularly, you don't have a chance to accumulate or to plan on longer perspectives. So how do they solve, how do actors solve to cope with this organized chaos?
Well, the point is in this organized chaos, the logic of the system is that it was individuals who react. In many ways, all the collective forces opposing that lost the argument against the micro-behavior of people over time. And that has been the logic. On this efficiency and legitimacy, this is a big issue, how you measure efficiency. In terms of legitimation, the whole point of the system is to identify, create, negotiate all the time, all new range of indicators which will demonstrate more efficiency. Because your own standards and your own revenue, or for agencies, their budgets, for instance, will depend on their capacity to reach the efficiency indicators which are set by the state. So the legitimacy of the system is it improves efficiency over time. Okay? And we can measure that. And the problem is when there is a discrepancy between ministers saying every day we improve the efficiency of this and that by 10% every 2 days, and your actual experience, because the more you codify, the more you're precise on all these target indicators, the more some activities which were part of the organizations are not done anymore. The classic example is that at some given point there was an urgency crisis in the hospitals. So the minister said, with our new system, we'll react very quickly. So for the next year, having a decreasing time to accept patients in urgency services in hospital would be the main target for hospital directors. So hospital directors did that. They improved the figures so that when people came in, there's a lower waiting time. The question is, nobody cared about how they did that. And the way they did that was to have a deal with the ambulance system. So when there were too many people in the waiting room, people would be in the cars circling around the hospital, and they would only move in when there was nobody waiting in the queue. Or they would deal with the other hospital next door, and people would move from one place to the next. So the average, so we have all this sort of behavior. So after a while, you have a huge legitimacy crisis because the indicators are less and less relevant over time. This is the limit. But for the first phase, legitimacy and efficiency go hand to hand, and they are linked in a very systematic way, but over time. And I'm told this is not so different from what we see in the organization of large banks or large companies. The questions of the reliability of your reporting system and what it means is a major problem. As we know, the certification of figures is a classic problem with software like SAP, German software, I think, yeah? This is exactly the same problems in large firms. So this is where we probably have to work on a more systematic basis, comparing the private and public sector along those lines.
Okay, back there.
Wolfgang Ludwig Meyerhofer, University of Siegen. I wish to thank you for this very clear and brilliant and enlightening contribution. And yes, the revolution is being exported to Germany. Yes, we are introducing such systems, for instance, to universities or to the public employment service. And my question is, there's one group of people which you did not mention in your talk, but to which alluded a little bit in your final comments, and that is most of the organizations we are talking about have clients, or as they are called nowadays, customers. And of course, these customers also suffer from these developments. For instance, if a university department is closed down, students that wish to study biology or archaeology or whatever have to go to another town where they perhaps didn't want to live in the first place. Or in the case of the public employment service, there's also benchmarking between public employment service institutions in different parts of the countries, and they are allocated money according to their performance. If they perform well, they are given less money, but the money in the final analysis, of course, goes down to the unemployed people, and if the institution, the local employment service institution, gets less money, it's the unemployed who get less money. So my question is, can you say something about how the customers, or as it's called nowadays, they must also be regulated, ruled somehow, or there must be some dissatisfaction on part of the customers, and how is that dealt with? Can you say a little bit about this?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Number one, the logic of a system is, of course, also partly based to some rational choice ideas, and to get the system at full length, you need to fragmentize and to divide the existing of all these bureaucracies. So you create lots of agencies in all sorts of ways, will be in competition with each other. So one of the problems from a customer point of view, as you said, is that it becomes extremely difficult to identify clearly what is going on and whether you have a better or different service. The second thing you have to accept is that lots of customers are also using different type of these services. And, the logic of the argument is that lots of people would argue, if you talk to, I don't know, doctors in the hospitals, they will tell you this system is very bad for us because we are good professionals and we know what we do. But I have to say that if we put more pressure on universities or the employment services, they should improve a bit more, because so there's also the logic, and that's what that's also the beauty of this mechanism, is that you tend to argue that your system or where you are, it's okay. The problem is the other ones which should be better. And there's always room for improvement in public services, of course. So the idea that you can legitimize that with better schools, better hospitals, more responsive bureaucracy, you know, it's very hard to measure precisely for an individual whether it's true or not true. You know, even in a hospital, how do you say things are better? Food is better, your heart attack was well dealt with. So if you have, 400 indicators on the hospital, it's always possible to argue that the service is better in some ways, but maybe not in some other ways. So it's very hard to identify or to organize collectively some element of dissatisfaction, because the whole thing is fragmented. And there are also some benefit, there are some benefit in the system. There are indeed some ways in which some services are being better delivered in some cases. So it's not all black and white. It's not just, the new system is very bad and there are also students who prefer to have a system like that because it's more responsive faculty and they have clear indicators of satisfaction and they can sue much more. So, because the system is changing, it's quite difficult. So the only response is the collective response at the political level. And then you have level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction, which may be aggregated. Or if you have some services which are precisely becoming completely dysfunctional. And then you have very big thing. But the political answer is always, yes, we will change, we improve the indicators, it will be better next time. Which is a very powerful rhetoric, in a way. Except that after a long time, when nobody believes the indicators anymore, then you're lost. And it's called Gordon Brown.
One last question.
Florence Rudolph, thank you very much for this communication. I would like to ask you first about the time of this process. I mean, the construction of these indicators or of these values that we have to follow is very short, and it's happened without participation. So it's a kind of autonomy which is imposed from for not insiders of the organization. And it's one point which is very important because it's not a democratical process, but it's yes, like autonomy but without autonomy.
Without control.
And another thing, just very short, excuse me, it's the very interesting thing is that the environmental movement or sustainability movement was in a certain way pushing this revolution, or maybe manipulated by this because of all this discourse of best practices. And it's very difficult to be against, to be better for, let's say, solidarity, social being together on environmental issues. And in fact, this process is destructuring all the sociability, and also it's against this kind of values. So it's a very tricky process. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your two questions again. Very interesting points. On the first point, not at all. It's a system which is produced over 10 years on average. Okay? So the making of these indicators is not top-down. Usually the starting point is we would like to put more money in the system, but we'd like to get better value for the system. Okay? So the logic is not let's impose and constrain. It's rather let's decide collectively what are the good indicators. How can we measure your activities? Because, like in the German university system, giving more money to excellence initiatives, if you don't have sanction, who could be against it in a way? Huh? And, if the point is to invest more in public services, then it makes sense to some extent to say, let's try to measure a bit more. And in this process, the key point is enrollment. Because you start by creating a set of indicators, then people say, it doesn't make any sense. And the government says, well, come along, we'll create a committee, and we'll bring in all different interests, and we'll try to improve the system. So it's a very collective process, in a way, with elements of, including direct democracy sometimes, but you can get it in some of these committees. And of course, at some point, the government says, okay, now we agree on the indicators, now we decide the improvement and the targets. That's a different process. But the making of those figures has always been a very collective process. And all these new organizations which were created always bring different professions, different groups to share and to participate to elaborating. And the government is always happy to have more indicators and more ideas and environment, social solidarity, everything, all these indicators are there. The problem is how you aggregate them in the next stage and how you set targets. So it's not just like bad technocrats, top-down, bringing new thing. It's a much more subtle way to do that. You enroll different interests by bringing them sharing some of these objectives over time. On your second point, yes, you're right. It has been used by some groups also along those lines. But that's always the case for these things are institutions in a classic sense. So institutions are used in a creative way by some actors. And some third sector groups, some associations have used those things to push their own priority. And as you rightly put out, some environment groups, for instance, have been very effective to bring in a lot of environment targets in the management of hospitals, for instance. So it's a very competitive process in that sense. And that's also where you make behavior predictable. You know that after a while, most of the interest will be enrolled into the process and will participate into the definition of objectives, and therefore will be also involved in the implementation stage. So it's a much more subtle way in that sense, and that's why it has been quite effective up to a point.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We will have a short break. Now we will reconvene at 20 minutes past 11 and then continue with the lecture of Wolfgang Streeck. Thank you.